Okay, so let's get started. So we're very happy to have Justin Solomon from Stanford here. Now, I've known Justin for a long time. I was consulting at Pixar, and he was an intern there. He wrote a very nice paper as he was an undergraduate on non-photorealistic rendering with Michael Cass. Since then, he has, of course, done some amazing work in geometry processing, and that's what he's going to be talking to us today. We are working in the Ogibus's group at Stanford. But beyond that, Justin's CV has like a long list of 10s or 20s or 30s of honors. And beyond his research, he has also had exceptional success in teaching. He's just published a book on numerical methods, teaching the mathematical methods course at Stanford. And he's also, his papers, besides interest in geometry processing and computer graphics, have also affected machine learning and medical and brain imaging types of applications. So let Justin tell us about his most recent work.
Oh, gosh, that's a lot. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm kind of a loud guy, so I'll try and reach a happy middle ground with this microphone here. But if I'm like blasting your ears out, you should just let me know. Right, so it's really a pleasure to be here today and to talk to you guys and share a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing that's really in sort of geometry very broadly considered. So we'll talk about problems that are in, we'll start with problems in computer graphics, which is the typical kind of world where we talk about geometry in a very concrete way and then step out farther and farther from there to some more abstract ideas. So just in case we haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I thought I'd spend just a few moments to introduce myself and to see if my clicker works. Yeah, right. So my experience over the last several years has been to do research in lots of different areas that roughly have a geometric mathematical kind of optimization theme. And so as part of that, I've spent a lot of time at Stanford, actually undergrad, master's, PhD, and some time as a teaching fellow, so lots of time there, as well as some time at Pixar. In fact, it was a pleasure to overlap a little bit with Ravi while I was there. Right, so some of our research, some of which you'll hear about today and some of which you won't, is touched upon problems including things in shape analysis, modeling, both sort of in three-dimensional shapes as well as sort of in the sort of statistical side, some applications in areas including brain imaging, simulation, and so on, and earlier in imaging, and more recently we've looked into sort of the high-dimensional version of geometry, which has some interplay with ideas that show up in machine learning in these areas. I've also recently been serving as a teaching fellow at Stanford, and as such I've managed to teach a bunch of different courses there. Most recently a class on sort of numerical analysis for computer science students. Previously I taught a differential geometry course, or I guess an applied differential geometry course, which is a little bit specific to my background in the graduate level, and long ago taught the graphics class. And of course, with an audience like this, I can't help but spend about 20 seconds to advertise that I do have a textbook that's coming out hopefully in the coming month. It's always subject to the whims of the publishing industry, but with any luck, it's made it through copy editing and all of the rest. The idea is it's another book on numerical algorithms, but and the particular focus here is an audience that's in computer science, right? So rather than focusing on numerical methods for simulating PDE around your airplane wing or something, we really chose lots of ideas in machine learning, computer vision, graphics, and so on, and tried to motivate and construct algorithms starting at that starting point. So a slightly different flavor. The PDF of the book is accidentally on my webpage for now. I encourage you to take a look before that gets noticed. Anyway, so enough of the high-level stuff. I thought. So I was thinking about the right theme of how to tell you guys about a lot of the research that we've been doing today. And so I came up with the kind of corny, high-level phrase of geometric data analysis. And unfortunately, if you Google for this phrase, what you'll find is that it means basically principal component analysis in the literature as it exists right now. That typically, when we talk about geometric data analysis, it refers to a class of methods in linear algebra and so on for sort of projecting things onto low-dimensional space. But to me, this is a phrase that we need to reclaim, and that really there are so many interesting ideas that couple geometry and the understanding of different types of data, both in low and high dimensions, that are really worth exploring. That really there's sort of two ways to interpret this phrase. The The one is that it's the analysis of geometric data. And certainly today you'll see a lot of projects that we've considered that involve data that's really closely coupled with an underlying domain, whether that's understanding population as it moves across the map of the United States, or in computer graphics applications where we have these giant databases of 3D shapes, or medical imaging scanning, and so on. Of course, you can move your red highlight to the right-hand side and also talk about this in terms of data analysis with a geometric flavor. And some of the insights that we've had with our experience understanding very concrete problems in sort of low-dimensional geometry turn out to have very high-dimensional implications in the sort of machine learning world for understanding when you can find a geometric structure in a data set and what you can say and use that structure for. So to me, this is sort of representative of a larger theme that I've seen sort of, I've personally had the chance to interact with a little bit as a computer scientist. And that's sort of a change in what we think of as geometry in computer science. So typically, maybe 15, 20 years ago, if you asked a computer scientist what geometry research would be, they probably think of something close to the image I've shown you on the left, which I'm presumably allowed to make fun of because it's from a paper that was written by my PhD advisor. But typically, sort of old school geometry in computer science was largely a domain inside of algorithms, right? It was understanding things like configurations of points and line segments and intersections and so on. And these are really valuable problems, and they certainly underlie a lot of the things that I'm working on. But now, if you look at the sort of proliferation of geometry within computer science, part of it is these algorithmic challenges, but a large part is actually on the modeling side. That we now don't think of geometry just as a source of tough algorithmic problems, but rather as a tool for sort of posing different problems and models in all kinds of areas, whether it's graph theory, geometry processing, obviously, semi-supervised learning, all uses sort of language that's geometric in flavor. And we see this coming up over and over again. So to me, if you want to be a person that's studying geometry in computer science now, there's really a lot of different pillars that you need to have in your a lot of different pieces to your toolbox that are required to be an effective researcher in this area. Right? In particular, the theory that we need in geometry and computer science no longer is geometry, circa 9th or 10th grade. Right now, in order to do geometry and computer science, we need to understand the interaction of shape, not just at the triangle level, but to be able to talk about ideas like curvature and Laplacians and geometric PDE and so on. This sort of advanced theory of geometry that's shown up, starting with Riemann and moving forward from there. But as computer scientists, that's not enough. Right? It's not enough to just understand the sort of theoretical side and these nice ideas of curvature and bending, but we also have to understand how to take problems in this nice continuous language, right, and in terms of metrics and covariant derivatives and so on, and actually pose them in discrete language, right? What is the proper discretization of these problems, whether it's on some triangle mesh in computer graphics context or a point cloud in a more abstract or noisy setting? And then once we have a nice discretization, we need to be able to actually optimize and understand this data. And the types of algorithms we can write down are actually quite different from just triangulation or Delaunay type problems that you might have considered in geometry in the past. And then finally, once we've completed this full loop and we have a nice computational theory of differential geometry, we need to go back and make sure that the tools that we come up with are sufficiently robust and understandable for an audience that probably doesn't care about the fact that we discretize curvature in a nice way. Right? This is a really interesting learning experience for me, both when I was working at Pixar and more recently working a little bit with the psychology group at Stanford. They don't care that I can measure the curvature of this brain slightly better than the last guy, but rather they really care about whether or not we can make interesting conclusions about their experiment. Right? And these are two very different end goals for research. And in large part, the sort of differential geometry literature has focused on the former, and now we need to take these language and these tools and make them robust and understandable enough for an end user that doesn't care so much about the sort of geometric accomplishment. Right? So obviously this is a very high-level story, and today I'm going to tell you about one framework that I've spent some time developing inside of this sort of geometry processing world for understanding shape. And the framework that I'll propose to you today is to pose geometric problems in a sort of softened or probabilistic language. And when I say this is going to be slightly different from maybe the Bayesian perspective or something that you see in machine learning, it almost goes back to basic ideas that really stem from measure theory itself and the basic constructions in probability. So to me, one of the many ways that you can interpret a probability distribution really is as an expression of a geometric feature. Right, so here I'm going to have a bunch of examples that are just in one dimension, right? So here my geometric domain is just the horizontal axis here, x, and I'll have a probability distribution rho of x that I'll show you on the vertical axis. Right, so here I have a Gaussian looking distribution, and to me a Gaussian is nothing more than a geometric feature that's telling me there's some point that's concentrated, somewhere around the mean of this Gaussian. Right? And of course, the nice thing about probability distributions is that as I widen their standard deviation, I make them bigger, I can introduce some uncertainty to this geometric expression. Of course, this language encapsulates the classical language that we have for understanding geometric features. Right? As I take this Gaussian distribution and I sharpen him about his mean, now I get just sort of a complicated way to express a single geometric feature like a point on my domain. But rather than just having points and sort of points with uncertainty, it is important to acknowledge that this language is fundamentally broader than this sort of basic language that we have in geometry. In particular, I can take, for example, 2 points and superpose them simply by having a bimodal probability distribution. So all of this is just to show you that really probability language can be used to encode lots of geometric features. But of course, if we're going to do that, then we need to take all of our basic ideas and operations from classical or computational geometry and repose them in this probabilistic language. Yeah, so here I've illustrated for you perhaps the simplest kind of geometric query that you might have about a probability distribution. So let's say that I have 3 probability distributions, P of xy, P1, and P2, and all 3 of them are sitting on top of some plane. Right? And I ask you a very simple question, which is that I have a query distribution, the black one on the left here, P of xy, and I ask you, with respect to the geometry of the plane underneath, which probability distribution is closer to P, P1 or P2? Yeah? Now, certainly from a sort of geometric perspective, our intuition is that P1 is closer to P in the sense that most points in this sort of red blob are close to points in this black blob rather than farther on P2. But now let's re-examine the typical pipeline that we have, certainly in geometry processing and somewhat in probability for understanding problems of this nature. So here I've switched from 2 dimensions to 1 dimension. So here we have 2 distributions, P1 and P2. And maybe certainly in functional analysis, what I might do is take these 2 probability distributions, subtract them, and take the norm. Right? I think of them as sort of high dimensional points. I go element by element by element, I square, and I sum. Now, of course, in information theory, we know that perhaps the right measure of divergence between probability distributions really isn't an L1 or L2 distance. In fact, it's not even so clear that L2 makes sense in this particular context. So maybe you use a measure like KL divergence, but fundamentally the machinery is the same. Namely, I proceed across all of these x values to do some separate calculation at each and then sum them all up. So now let's return to our original question, which is which probability distribution, P1 or P2, is closer to P? And unfortunately, with respect to any measure that you construct this way, the answer is actually neither, that they're all equidistant from one another. And that's because effectively, the measures that are proposed to you, right, where you think of these guys as functions and then you subtract and take the norm of the difference, yeah, this is a measure of how much they overlap. It's not a measure of geometric distance along the underlying plane. Right? So to put it another way, we're comparing probability distributions vertically, right, by subtracting, rather than horizontally by matching where these things move. Right? Like if I were to ask you to describe the distribution, the difference between the blue distribution and the red one here, probably what you'd say is the red one is more to the right. But that's not what the measurements that we just did are actually carrying out in practice. Yeah, so this is certainly, I'm not the first guy to acknowledge that this is a problem. And in fact, there's a nice literature on sort of what types of measurements you can do that really do respect the geometry of the underlying domain when you're comparing probability distributions. And I've illustrated that here. And this is a notion of the distance between probability distributions is called the Earth mover's distance. How many of us have seen this before, by the way? Interesting. The left-hand side of the room has. Huh. What do you know? Okay, so the Earth mover's distance between probability distributions is kind of what I've illustrated for you here. So what you do is you think of the 2 distributions as 2 big piles of sand that sit on some domain. And now, with its shovel, I can take distribution 1 and transform him into distribution 2 by shoveling up the sand, walking over to the other guy, and dropping it back down. Right? And there are lots of different ways to do that. Right? I could obviously shovel the guy up, take a lap around the earth and then drop it back down, or I could do something more efficient. And so what I'm going to do is solve a linear program that optimizes for the minimum amount of work that it takes to transform one distribution into another in this model. Right? So the amount of money that I charge for moving an amount of mass m, a distance from x to y, is just mass times distance. Right? It's a measure of work. Of course, what I've shown you here is not exactly very precise, but it's not too difficult to formalize this a little bit in the language of linear programming. Yeah, so here I've chosen to use kind of discrete notation. So you should think of P and Q as histograms or probability distributions, and T as a matrix that says how much mass went from bin I of probability distribution P to bin J of probability distribution Q. Right? And so you can see that our two constraints here are saying that T starts at P and ends at Q. And over all of the possible ways to do that, I want to minimize mass times distance. Yep. This is a linear program. Okay, so you guys should stop me now if you don't understand, because the rest of this talk is going to be really boring if you're not following. Excellent. Okay. Right, so now we're going to generalize ever so slightly. So how many of us have seen the Wasserstein distance between probability distributions? Excellent. Okay, so only one. All right, so the Wasserstein distance is nothing more than sort of a continuous version of exactly the same measurement. Right, so here we're going to replace sums with integrals because that's sort of the continuous thing here. And we have some domain, which is a metric space x. Right? And so x is accompanied by a function d, which is the distance between any pair of points. Right? And so over all ways to couple, let's see here, distribution mu to distribution nu, I'd like to minimize exactly the same thing we had before, which is the mass, now this is in kind of differential language, times the distance it travels. And I'm going to generalize slightly to the distance to the pth power. And it turns out that this value p is going to make a little bit of a difference. Right? So if I take p equals 1, you'll recover what we had on the previous slide. Yeah? Now, I made this more general in the sense that this is kind of a nice measure theoretic version of the earth mover's distance we had on the previous slide. But in fact, we're also going to make it a little more specific. That is, I'm going to give this function d of xy some structure. Right? So right now, all that we care about, I mean, this linear program is solvable for any function d of xy, at least if he's positive. But what I'm going to say is that I'm going to assume that d of xy is a geodesic distance along some geometric domain. Right? So geodesic distance is nothing more than the length of the shortest path between pairs of points, subject to the constraint that you can't leave the surface. Right? So here's the level sets of the geodesic distance function on this model here. So they're kind of little concentric circles. Right? And by adding this geodesic distance cost assumption, we're going to be able to optimize this objective a lot better than we could if we didn't know anything about the function d. Yeah? So very roughly, a number of my research papers over the last several years have focused on different aspects of this problem. In particular, the kind of interesting thing I saw is that really these pillars of geometry that I see as sort of a very large-scale theme of research in this area really have come to play in the research that we've done on the Earth mover's distance. So we're going to have to start with this very theoretical ideas of how do you understand this distance even before discretization or making any computational tools. Then once we find the right sort of theoretical understanding of these distances, we can discretize, carry out the proper optimization we're going to need, and finally present it to our end users in a way that is robust, understandable, and doesn't really require knowledge of deep ideas from measure theory. I mean, the basic ideas of the Wasserstein distance are quite challenging. In fact, Villani just got a Fields Medal for some topics that are related to this. But as a computational tool, it's actually quite useful and a very intuitive object to work with. So I chose to organize the rest of today's talk sort of in a couple different vignettes of sort of different application areas we've considered for this particular hammer. I should emphasize, by the way, somebody pointed out while I was giving this talk a little while ago that it's easy to sort of listen to this and ask the question of, well, is this guy just only interested in using this one hammer to solve all of the different types of problems? The answer is no, but we do happen to have a number of papers with a similar theme here. So I'm going to organize this talk sort of based on different application areas we've considered. We'll talk about the specific sort of considerations you need for a particular area, and then sort of step back and see what applications that the right computation machinery can enable. Right, so we'll start with Earth mover's distance in computer graphics. And in particular, I'll discuss with you a paper we had at SIGGRAPH last year and a paper we will have someday. The usual story. So in computer graphics domains, we can think of a probability distribution over, say, a triangle mesh. Right? So a triangle mesh is typically the way that we express a shape. And triangle meshes are built of thousands, millions of little vertices linked together into these triangles. When I talk about a probability distribution in this context, I'm talking about one number per vertex of this giant simplicial complex, subject to the constraint that all of these values sum up to 1, right? Or perhaps sum up to 1 with respect to some area weights if you're in finite element. Now, if we return to the original optimization problem we had for Earth movers distances, we'll realize that this is not a scalable option for 2 different reasons. Whoops, what did I just do? Okay. Right, so the first is that this is a quadratically scaling linear program. That is, we have this matrix Tij, that is the amount of mass I move from every point I to every point j, which is a very large matrix to optimize for. In fact, it can't even fit in memory in the typical applications we consider. Now, if you're in the linear programming world, you might look at this and say, well, Justin, that's not 100% true. In fact, by complementary slackness or whatever your favorite property is, really we can guarantee that this matrix Tij is quite sparse. But even so, there's a subtle issue here, which is that even before I solve this problem, as input to specifying the problem, I need this pairwise distance matrix D of xi, xj. And this is considered input to the linear program itself. Right? And this matrix, this pairwise distance between every pair of points on your surface, is quite large and quite difficult to compute. Yeah? So even before we solve this linear program, we're already kind of hooked. And it's not sparse. Yeah, everything about this is just really upsetting. So what we proposed last year for this problem, and this is for the 1 Wasserstein distance. That is the distance where moving mass from x to y, you charge proportional to the distance from x to y, is to actually use Eulerian language to pose this problem. So now I'm going to borrow some ideas from fluid dynamics. It's kind of surprising that this happened. So there are 2 different ways, in sort of partial differential equation land, there are 2 different ways to understand a fluid that's sloshing around in a tank of water. Right? The first is language that's called Lagrangian language. So effectively, when you have a Lagrangian fluid, what you're doing is you're tracking little particles of mass as they move around your tank. Right? So as a function of time, you kind of know where each molecule went. Yeah? But an alternative way to sort of pose and understand the language of fluid dynamics is to use Eulerian language. Okay. You know what? I'm kind of loud. I can just yell if. Okay, whatever. Right. So an alternative way to pose fluid language is to use this language that's proposed by Euler. And what Euler said is that rather than tracking around little molecules of mass as they float around in your tank, I'm going to stand still at a single cell inside of my tank and look at the flux of fluid as it moves in and out of the cell. Right? So rather than tracking molecules, I'm going to just stay in one place and watch the fluid slosh past. So, yes, sir?
So if you had just, it was a one-dimensional problem, and there are just distributions on the line,
yes, sir.
Then you could think of it as you're like sending a bus from one end to the other, and the people from one distribution are getting on the bus, and then they're getting off the bus at their stop.
Yes.
And so you really just have to keep track of how many people are on the bus because...
Yeah, so it's a dynamic programming problem in one dimension.
So is that what you're doing here in multiple dimensions?
Yeah, and in fact there's sort of. I think it's actually closer to maybe a network flow interpretation, that you're keeping track of one flow per edge rather than sort of mass that moves along the track. But hopefully this will clarify a little bit in a minute. Right, but you can think of the way that we posed this Earth mover distance problem as Lagrangian, in the sense that if you look at that giant linear program, right, we're really keeping track of every particle of mass as it moves from I to j. But instead, what we can do is switch to Eulerian language and think about the 2 probability distributions on your domain as the concentration of a fluid at 2 points in time. And then over all of the ways that you could advect from one distribution to another, that is, you kind of transform it by moving along this vector field, I want to choose the one that minimizes work. And it turns out that this isn't just a high-level similar story. In fact, you can come up with a 100% mathematically equivalent formulation of this distance problem that really uses this Eulerian language. And I've given it to you here. So here, J is a tangent vector field to my surface. And basically, what this equation is telling you, so this constraint down here is the advection equation. What this says is that J in 1 unit of time transforms rho 0 into rho 1 by flowing mass along that vector field J. And there are lots of vector fields that can do this. And so over all of the possible ones that can do this, I want to choose the one that minimizes this particular measure of work, which is the integral of sort of the one norm of J. Notice that there's no square here. If it's square, you don't even get a distance, which is unfortunate. Right? Now, you might look at this and say, well, Justin, why the heck would you pose this problem this way, right? I took what was already kind of a yucky measure theoretical problem, and now I've introduced, well, I've taken a linear program, and I've now made the objective convex but nonlinear. I've now introduced PDE language into this problem. Somehow this seems even more complicated than where I started. However, there's one aspect of this problem that gets easier, and that's the number of unknowns in this optimization. So remember that before I was optimizing for this matrix Tij, which is the amount of mass that went from every point I to every point j. Right? This is a quadratically scaling object. But if you look at this sort of theoretical version of optimal transportation, there's only one unknown per point here, which is this vector j. Yeah? And so from sort of a big O standpoint, the number of unknowns here is far fewer than the number of unknowns in the linear program that I wrote down for you before. And in fact, we can do a little bit better by using sort of domain-specific knowledge we have about differential equations. So you might recall from calculus class that you can take any vector field. It turns out that it works on a surface. It's all, you probably proved it on the plane. You can take any vector field and decompose them as the sum of 2, or more generally, 3 terms. Right? So you can take a vector field j and decompose them as the sum of the gradient of a function, which is called the curl-free component of your vector field, and the gradient of a function rotated 90 degrees in the tangent plane. This is called the divergence-free part of your vector field. If I poke a hole in this sphere so that it becomes a donut, then I need a third term, which is a harmonic piece. You'll have to trust me that our algorithm works okay in that case. I decided not to go into that detail. And something really nice happens in this optimization problem if I plug in this Hodge decomposition of j. So remember that my constraint looks like the divergence of j is the difference of these two probability distributions. Now, I'm going to plug in the Hodge decomposition, and what happens is that, well, the divergence of a divergence-free vector field, unsurprisingly, is 0. So in the end, the divergence of j is only the divergence of this one piece. And in fact, div of grad of something is Laplacian. Right? This Laplacian is this operator that just sums up the second derivatives of your function. And this is a well-known equation that I can just solve independently of this optimization. That is, basically, from just a linear solve, I can recover this function f. Yeah, so my optimization for computing Earth movers distances now is quite fast. It happens in 2 steps. So if we go back to our original thing here, and we're going to substitute in the Hodge decomposition, this Hodge decomposition of j, then I can recover f basically for free by just a linear solve. And all that's left is optimizing for this function g. Yeah? So what happens is first I do just a nice sparse linear solve to find this function f, and then I have an unconstrained convex optimization for the remaining part. This is already something that I can optimize for, even just by using gradient descent. And in fact, by using ADMM, everybody's sort of favorite optimization method this year, we can do this in basically near real time for large-scale triangle meshes that appear in computer graphics. Now, of course, in computer graphics literature, you might not realize that there's a very slight dividing line between interactive and real time. This is our sort of polite language for not quite 30 frames per second. And this certainly lives on the interactive side rather than the real-time side. But if you would like to squeeze that last little fraction of a second out, you can by introducing sort of a spectral approximation for this function g. And then really, basically, our entire optimization problem boils down to an optimization in a few hundred variables, which is very small. Right, so there are lots of applications that you can have for Earth movers distances once you can compute them efficiently. So one of them is actually a little bit sort of circuitous. You might think of it as kind of a backward story. So let's say that I have 2 distributions, like the blue guy and the red guy here, and I sharpen them about their means, right? I make them very peaked. Then quite obviously, the Earth mover's distance from this guy to this guy converges to the honest to goodness shortest path distance between their 2 center points. Yeah? And so what this actually gives you is a very indirect way to compute the shortest path between 2 points on a surface, right? Or what I can do is I can represent my 2 points as little delta distributions that are just peaked at those locations, and then use the machinery that I've proposed to you to compute the distance. And what comes out is actually something that's competitive with techniques that are much more specialized for computing distances between points constrained to move only along the surface. And in fact, when you introduce the spectral approximation, you can get something that's insanely fast for computing these things. one of the nice things that this gives you if you're a theoretician is that it gives you a nice way to sort of, it gives you you can think of it as a slider between something that is purely computable from the Laplacian of your surface, which is sort of, if you're familiar with sort of machine learning literature on distances, you might have heard of this biharmonic distance between points, which you can kind of recover by solving a Poisson equation. So if you remove our spectral approximation altogether, you just zero out that term, you recover something that looks like a harmonic equation. And then as you move your slider to the right-hand side, you have something that converges to geodesic distance. This is one nice connection between these two sort of areas. Theoretically, we can actually prove, which is kind of interesting, that even if you truncate and approximate these functions f and g in assorted ways, you get something that's no longer, we can't say it's the geodesic distance anymore, but it still satisfies the triangle inequality. It's still a distance, which is actually kind of surprising. Typically, when you approximate these things, you end up with something that's close to a distance, but not 100%. But here, even after you sort of approximate, you still recover something with nice theoretical properties. So of course, this is a problem that's very well studied, and computing geodesic distances on a surface is something we have about 1,000 ways to do. And so it's important to consider problems that are enabled by this machinery rather than things we already could solve. And one of them was posed actually in the sort of path planning literature a while back, which I've illustrated for you here. So in path planning, obviously, so let's say that you think of a surface that's embedded in 3 dimensions. And the surface itself is interesting, but really the surface is a wall, right? It's and I'm trying to navigate around this space in a way where I don't just walk through the walls. Yeah, kind of a very simple, version 0.0 of a path planning problem. And so one way to pose a lot of problems in this language is to ask for a distance function on all of 3-dimensional space that has a very particular property that makes it different from just, the straight line distance. And that's, given a surface that's embedded in 3D, I'd like to have a distance function that satisfies the following property, which is that if I choose 2 points, if those 2 points happen to be chosen on the surface itself, I get the geodesic distance out. So in other words, I'm taking this pairwise geodesic distance function and extending it to all of R3. Yeah? And it turns out that the one way that you can do this is actually using our machinery, because there's plenty of tools out there for taking any points in 3-dimensional space and actually expressing them as a linear combination of points on the surface. In fact, this is an underdetermined problem. There are lots of different ways to do this. And basically what you can do is you can use the Earth mover's distance between the linear combination weights as a proxy for the distance between points in 3-dimensional space. And what comes out is a distance function that's tuned to the surface as it sits in space. So for instance, the shortest path between these 2 red points in the interior of the spiral is no longer a straight line, but rather goes right down the center. And so this is useful for applications where what you really care about when you're planning your path is not so much just taking the shortest path with respect to some extrinsic measure of shortest, but really something that's tuned to the fact that you have a piece of geometry that's sitting there. Other applications of this machinery can be considered optimizations over Earth mover's distance. Right? So far, the applications I've given you basically involve computing this distance and using this value for something. But another way you can think about this problem is you can incorporate it into a larger optimization objective. For instance, let's say that I have 6 probability distributions on this 3-dimensional hand model. This happens a lot, for example, if I have sort of a weak system where I'm just collecting people's input as a signal over a shape, like people are marking points of interest or have sort of conflicting ideas of edits that they want to a 3-dimensional shape. And I have to rectify these things by averaging them somehow. Right? But unfortunately, if I average these 6 signals sort of algebraically, I just sum them up, divide by 6, what I got is I took 6 sort of single mode probability distributions, and I got a 6-moded probability distribution out that's kind of just the superposition of all these things. But for many applications, what I'd really want is some better sort of geometric idea of the average of these distributions, which is something like what I've shown you on the right-hand side here. Is that if I average the 6 distributions, which are concentrated on the fingers and on the palm, then I should get something at sort of the midpoint of all of these locations on the surface. Right? And this is something that shows up time and time again, both in the sort of geometry processing literature, in particular, when you're registering surfaces, oftentimes you get lots of weak signals for sort of which points correspond to which, and you want to rectify these things. And also in image processing when you're aligning surfaces. So this is a really nice piece of machinery. We've now taken this insanely humongous, quadratically scaling linear program and boiled it down to basically a sparse linear solve and then an optimization in a few hundred variables. This is humongous savings, at least in our context. But unfortunately, it doesn't actually solve 100% of the problems that we really want to solve in the area of optimal transportation. In particular, I've illustrated for you here a kind of a failure mode of this particular machinery. So this graph takes a little bit of interpretation to read, so let me step you through it a little bit. So here, these illustrate one-dimensional probability distributions, and that dimension is the vertical axis. So here you have a singly peaked Gaussian right at the center, yeah? And on the right-hand side, I have a mixture of two Gaussians. And what I've shown you here is I've set up a task which is find me the probability distribution that is halfway, or t fraction of the way, between the left distribution and the right distribution with respect to the distance function I wrote down. And unfortunately, for the one Wasserstein distance, this distance that I've been talking to you about, what you get is behavior like what I've shown you in the bottom. That in fact, this problem is not strictly convex, and one of the many optima you can get when you optimize for the average of two probability distributions is this totally boring solution, right? All it does is takes mass from the center guy and just kind of teleports it to the other peaks like that, right? But for many computer graphics applications in particular, we really care about interpolation between things in a nice geometric way. So what we'd prefer is to take the mass in the left distribution, split him into two parts, and really move it along the shortest path to the right. And this is a property known as displacement interpolation, and it is a property of the two Wasserstein distance. This is one of these small details that you don't think should matter, but makes all of the difference in theory. That really, when you move mass from x to y, you want to charge proportional to the distance squared between these 2 points. So naturally, this year we set out to solve that problem. And unfortunately, that problem computationally is much harder. There does exist a nice fluid dynamical interpretation of the two Wasserstein distance. In fact, it's better known in the theory of optimal transportation. But it scales sort of in a similar way to the original linear program. You don't actually get the same nice savings that we got. But this year, using a completely separate set of machinery, we're able to introduce a really nice tool for computing sort of a regularized version of the two Wasserstein distance. And here I've shown you kind of a goofy example of the output. So I have 3 different shapes, a donut, a cow, and a rubber duck. And I've expressed them as sort of implicit functions in a cube. And by using this machinery, I can nicely, seamlessly transform from one to the next. And so this is really an optimization over Earth movers distances, right? I'm trying to find the weighted average of these different points with respect to this distance. So the way out of this problem, interestingly, is completely different from the way out of the one Wasserstein distance problem. So here, I've switched from linear programming language to continuous, but it's quite similar. So here, this is our original optimization problem, but now I'm charging you distance squared. And I'm going to add a second energy term to my optimization, which is the entropy of this matrix pi. Remember, pi is the amount of mass that moves from each point to each other point. And so now, as I introduce this parameter gamma, as I make him bigger and bigger, I take my original transportation matrix, which it has this very thin slice where points are matched up, and I make it fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier. Yeah, but something really surprising happens, which is that this optimization problem for any positive gamma actually has fewer unknowns than the original. The original scales quadratically, and this scales linearly. This is quite surprising. And it has to do with an observation that some folks made just a year ago about problems of this nature, which is that if you have an entropy regularized linear program that has this particular form, you can write it in a very different way, which is that what you really want to do is you're trying to minimize the KL divergence. KL divergence is another measure of sort of similarity of probability distributions. You're trying to minimize the KL divergence between this transportation matrix pi and this particular matrix here, which is e to the minus distance squared. Yeah? But KL divergence is nothing more than a distance, and it's unlike the Earth movers distance, it's quite easy to evaluate, right? It's just the sum of sort of p log p. Yeah? And so in fact, what you can do is you can view, in fact, I've given you KL divergence down here. You can view this problem as a projection of this matrix here onto the set of transportation matrices pi. Remember, there are constraints on pi that it sums to the two probability distribution, right? And there are lots of really efficient optimization algorithms that are specifically designed for this projection case. Right? In particular, there's this alternating projection technique that if I have these two sets, I can kind of project back and forth onto the two of them. And here, I have a very natural division of my constraints, right? I have two constraints, namely that pi sums in one direction to your first distribution and in the other direction to the other distribution. And it turns out the alternating projection algorithms for this are insanely efficient, they're easy to write down, and the sort of KKT conditions for this are quite favorable. And so in this paper, we sort of consider optimizations in this particular form. And in fact, we take it one step farther, which is that, okay, so what it turns out is that optimization in this world ends up basically multiplying by this matrix a lot of times. Right? But in computer graphics, we know that multiplying something by the matrix of e to the minus distance squared is nothing more than convolving with a Gaussian. Right? It's blurring an image out. And this is something we can do insanely quickly on images. And in fact, recently, sort of an idea has been proposed in the geometry processing geometry processing world, which is that this matrix looks an awful lot like the heat kernel of your domain, right? The heat kernel being sort of this matrix that defines how heat diffuses from point to point in a finite amount of time t. Right? So even on curved surfaces, we can compute our thing very quickly by using the heat kernel rather than this kind of complicated matrix in geodesic distance. And what comes out is a very efficient algorithm for not only computing Earth movers distances, but also solving these sort of barycenter averaging problems and so on. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to give you guys the details of this paper. I'd love to sketch it out for you. If you have time, I'm happy to write it out on the board. It's actually quite simple and kind of nice to learn. But I'll skip to some nice applications we have. And one of the fun things about this paper is that we could take kind of a farthest point sampling of lots of different sort of applications of computer graphics that might be of interest. Oops, I keep bumping onto something. Right. So for instance, the BRDF of a surface is sort of this function which says, if I have a unit of light coming in this point, then how does that, unit of light energy get bounced out to the world around it? Ravi is probably a much better person to explain these phenomena than I am. And one question you can ask is how can I average and sort of explore the space of BRDFs given a few samples? And this is a very natural language for posing these sorts of problems and solving this type of optimization. In image processing, I could ask, for example, can I take the colors of this image and apply it to the sort of features that I see in that one, right? And so one way to do that would be to think of colors as a distribution over color space, right? Just over RGB. And then our machinery gives you a nice way to sort of identify these different distributions over RGB, and then I can transfer the histograms of color from one image to another. And of course, sort of the most obvious application of machinery like this is for interpolating between shapes. I particularly like the image on the left because it shows you actually a drawback of a technique in this class. Remember that I introduced this entropic regularizer to my optimization problem, right? So even if I sort of average very sharp shapes, in this case it's implicit functions, what comes out is something a little bit fuzzy. And this is the drawback of a method in this domain. But what I would argue is that in the computer graphics literature, we're really good at taking sort of fuzzy shapes like this and sharpening them into just a sort of a 0-1 signal. But what we're not so good at is actually interpolating between these shapes in a way that it deals with, for example, changes in topology, geometry, and so on. And the nice thing here is that this algorithm literally is like 5 lines of code. It just iteratively applies the Gaussian filter, then does something algebraic, and goes back and forth between these things. Kind of surprising. Right. So now that I've laid you guys a lot of groundwork, the remaining applications I'll tell you about that are going to be a lot easier to describe. So we're going to move from 2 dimensions, right, surfaces and images, to 4 dimensions, and talk about problems in correspondence between surfaces. In particular, this is sort of 2 papers we've had at the symposium on geometry processing, and we have a 3rd one that may or may not show up someday soon. Right, so the correspondence problem is quite simple to pose, right? You're given 2 surfaces, either 2 scans of the same object or 2 instances of objects in the same class. And the question is, which points on the first guy correspond to which points on the second? Right? And this becomes really a challenge for a lot of reasons. For example, in this instance here, right, these are fundamentally not the same shape, so it's not clear that they can be aligned at the finest scale. And even if I just had 2 instances of the same star, this correspondence problem is still kind of ambiguous in the sense that there's this 5-point symmetry, and so there are 5 different maps that are all equally likely to be good maps in the absence of more information. So in practice, when you run algorithms like this is a screenshot from one of my early papers, you get some really bizarre output. In particular, for example, here we've run, I think we ran our functional mapping paper on this pair of cats. By the way, if you see this pair of cats in a graphics paper, it's because it's like the world's easiest test case. And even here, what ended up happening is we matched the 2 paws on the front properly and the 2 paws on the back of the cat in kind of an orientation reversing way. And in the middle, God knows what happened. Right? And that's because sort of locally, this map actually looks okay, in the sense that the middle of your cat just kind of looks like a cylinder. There's no interesting geometric information there. The paws are, matched in a way that's kind of reasonable. But obviously, we would like to avoid this type of distortion and animal abuse in our research. And so there's a lot to do here. So in this particular line of research, one thing that we've thought about is a convex relaxation of the mapping problem that I've shown you here, which is that rather than taking points on one surface to points on another, we're going to take points on one surface to probability distributions over the other. Right? This is a relaxation of the original problem, but it's quite nice. Remember, originally we're basically optimizing for permutations of points, which is not a happy space to be in. But the space of probability matrices is actually quite a nice, easy sort of convex space to be in. Yeah? But if we want to optimize in this world, we have to redefine what it means to get a continuous map. Remember, a continuous or a smooth map has to do with, if I take two nearby points on the source, I want two nearby things on the target. But now I've replaced points with probability distributions on the right. And given the first part of this talk, it's probably predictable where I'm going to go with here, which is that, to me, a continuous map, right, is one that takes, in this particular relaxation, is one that takes nearby points over here, so nearby distributions on the target with respect to the Wasserstein or Earth mover's distance. And in fact, this isn't just a high-level observation. What we've been able to show in this line of research is that you can take some sort of classical measures of the smoothness of a map, and when you relax them the proper way, what really does come out is precisely this nice optimal transportation language. In particular, let's say that I have a map phi that takes points to points. Then a very typical sort of optimization objective for smooth mapping in differential geometry is something called the Dirichlet energy of your map. The Dirichlet energy means that you take the gradient, right? You take its derivative. You just take the norm of the derivative and integrate this thing over the surface. Right? And this is some measure of how much your map is stretching or distorting your surface. Now, what we've proposed is to look at the ratio of 2 Wasserstein distance on the target to geodesic distance on the source. And in fact, what you can show is that when you take the proper limits and integrals and all of these nice things that I've spared for you here, you can actually recover the Dirichlet energy of a map in sort of a nice convex relaxation way. That is, if you encode a map using delta functions, you get this value, and otherwise you get something that kind of smoothly starts to deviate from it. And the intuition for this is actually quite nice. So now I have, remember, a map from points to probability distributions. So now if I draw a curve on my source surface, I get kind of a time-varying sequence of probability distributions on the target. And effectively what this is doing is looking at these vector fields that are vecting around the mass in these probability distributions. Remember, just like I talked about this Eulerian view of the world in optimal transportation. And it's basically just taking the norm of these vector fields as they move around mass. This is sort of a general Dirichlet energy for a map. So this gives you a nice way to sort of analyze maps. And of course, the obvious question here is, can you optimize this objective to actually compute a harmonic map? That is, to compute something that minimizes this value. And this is still an open problem for us. So this is quite challenging because this optimization objective has tons and tons of little Earth mover's distance terms. But remember, each one of those terms is itself a giant optimization problem. And only recently, actually, in this paper we just submitted, do we have any hope of computing things that are at the bottom of this energy. And thank God, what comes out is really something that looks like a harmonic map. Yeah, so in this Entropic Regularized Earth mover's distance paper, we show an example where, in fact, what you recover is a nice smooth map between armadillos. But since we regularize, you do have fuzzy targets for your points instead of sharp ones. So for our final application today, we'll consider an application of machine learning very quickly. And this is sort of an application, we published this in ICML last year, slightly different context, but we'll see that the machinery is actually quite similar. So now our domain is going to be quite different. Rather than talking about a geometric domain like a shape, I'll tell you about a graph. In particular, let's say we're on a network of web pages. Obviously, this network is quite complicated, so let's move to closer to the network of my web page, which looks something like this. So I have 3 pages, and they're connected by links between them. Yeah? And perhaps, for whatever reason, I've put a hit counter on page 1 and page 3, but not on page 2. Yeah? So what I've noticed is that most people visit this page around noon, and most people visit this page at about 2 o'clock. And my question is, when do people visit the page in the middle? Under the assumption that most of my traffic comes from moving sort of left, right along the website. Yeah? Now, my collaborator, Marco, points out that this example is a little bit facetious in the sense that people probably visit web pages faster than 1 page per hour, but hopefully you get the kind of philosophical idea here, even if the illustration is a little broad. Right? So probably what you would predict is not something like this, if this is really your model, that people move left and right through your site. Right? But this is what happens if you minimize sort of you say, okay, well, the distribution of users here is sort of an average of the guy on the left and the guy on the right, and then you get a bimodal distribution in the center. But really what you would expect is that sort of if you're proceeding linearly in time, then people would visit this web page at the time halfway in between the times they visit the other two. And this is a statistical model that is true for certain types of data, not true for other types of data. But for many of the applications we considered, makes a lot of sense. So in general, we can pose a Dirichlet problem on a graph that looks like this, where every single node of my graph is labeled with a probability distribution over another domain. For example, every page on my website is labeled with a distribution over the clock of when users are visiting that page. And now, simply given a couple nodes that are missing this distributional label, I'd like to fill it in. Yeah? And since we're using this particular hammer in today's talk, one way to do that would be to minimize the total sort of earth mover distance between every pair of distributional labels along this graph. And we call this the Wasserstein Propagation problem. And in fact, while this is a large optimization problem, as I've told you in the previous, there is one example, which unfortunately I seem to have lost the audience member who caught this ahead of time, which is that in one dimension, this is actually quite an easy optimization to carry out. And that's because the earth mover's distance between two probability distributions in 1D is nothing more than the L2 distance between their inverse cumulative distribution functions, or their quantile functions. This only happens in one dimension. In any higher dimension, you get totally hosed. So this nice connection falls apart. But in one dimension, this is the case. In fact, if you ever have one-dimensional distributions and you're doing some computation over them, I highly recommend you just try this and see if it gets you a better result. Sometimes it does. This is not a terribly well-known fact. But what happens is that oftentimes this giant linear program I've posed to you for the Wasserstein Propagation problem actually boils down to just a linear solve in this other space. So in this paper, we're able to analyze, not only provide a nice algorithm in this case, but also provide a theoretical analysis of the sort of data that this is successful for, what we can expect, and so on. There's a nice connection to PDE. And in fact, oftentimes you get better results on real-world data. So in this paper, we test on a lot of different weather data, which has this kind of nice geometric structure. And what comes out is some nice predictive stuff. One sort of last thing to note is that this gives you a nice pipeline for this world of manifold-valued learning. Right? So oftentimes we want to learn functions from some domain to some other domain. But when the target of that domain isn't just Euclidean space, then a lot of our favorite machinery, all of these sort of SVM-looking tools don't work so well. But one potential pipeline for manifold-valued learning is to, instead of thinking of taking values that are points on your domain, think of them as distributions over that target domain. Then you can solve nice convex problems using the language that I've posed for you today, and then kind of read off a manifold-valued answer from the result of the optimization. And so in this paper, we prove a couple conditions under which this whole diagram commutes, that you relax, but in fact the relaxation is tight. What you recover is just a single point, and you get something nice. Right, so to kind of conclude, today we've heard from three vignettes in three very different worlds, right? In computer graphics, in sort of geometric registration, and then in machine learning. And in each case, there are some commonalities and some really nice structure that is shared by these different problems, as well as some computational considerations that's unique to the particular context. And this is certainly a theme that comes up time and time again. I would say the main takeaway sort of technically is that really this probability distributional language, when you couple it with the right metrics and the right understanding, actually gives you a really nice language for a lot of different geometric operations, even when you're incorporating things like uncertainty into these calculations. Right? Just today, we've seen a notion of distance, we've seen a notion of the derivative of a map, we've seen a Dirichlet energy. In fact, you can even measure things like curvature all in probabilistic space. It's quite surprising you can do this. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that this is not the hammer for all nails. There are problems that are more difficult in this space. For example, problems of a topological nature are quite challenging in probabilistic language. Right? In topology, oftentimes we talk about measurements like the index of a map, the amount of times that it kind of wraps around a domain. And unfortunately, these types of measurements are quite challenging in probability because all maps are homotopic to all other ones in probabilistic language. That is, I can take t times one distribution and 1 minus t times another and get something that's halfway in between. Right? So all distributions are connected to all other ones by a straight line. So the topology of this set of distributions is quite boring. Also, something that we've seen in today's talk is that we'll often take kind of a small-scale non-convex problem and make it into a large-scale convex problem. And there's a very careful sweet spot you have to be in there for when this is computationally the right thing to do. So in this particular project, there's all kinds of exciting things that can happen. We recently hosted a whole workshop at NIPS for optimization, or rather for applications of optimal transportation. One of the really exciting things that we're seeing is that this Earth mover distance problem is moving from just an interesting kind of optimization, theoretical problem to just like a nice theoretical tool that makes sense for posing a lot of different, pieces of machinery. And so at this workshop, if you go through the sort of the proceedings that we had, you'll see that people were proposing for image processing, they're proposing for data analysis, for other things. It's interesting to see how this stuff continues. Unfortunately, computationally, one thing that you might have noticed in my talk is that every single optimal transportation algorithm I gave you included some regularization or assumption on the domain. And the sort of most general version of this problem is largely an open sort of theoretical algorithmic problem. Right, and more broadly, I would say this is an instance where we sort of have had nice themes in large-scale geometric optimization, understanding the connection between smooth geometry and noisy, discrete problems, and connections to application areas where really what we care about is data analysis, understanding shapes, and so on, rather than the sort of theoretical accomplishment of computing Wasserstein distances. Of course, I should be very clear. I have a lot of collaborators in this work. You might have noticed on all of these papers, we sort of have, choose K different authors on any given paper in this particular area, and that certainly continues. And it's been such a pleasure to work with people in, everywhere from just the totally theoretical mathematical side of optimal transportation to like how you engineer these big computer graphics systems. And I should again emphasize to you that while today's talk focused on this one particular tool, I do have experience in other ones, and I'm happy to chat with you about that offline. But for now, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them or to chat with you offline. I'm around for the next day or two, and it's been really it's been a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you.
So you talked about applications in neuroscience. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Let's see here. In neuroscience, well, we've worked originally. So a problem that people care about a lot in the sort of world of MRI data is registration. And in particular, this problem of sort of finding maps between the surfaces and the interiors of three-dimensional brain models is quite a challenging problem because we don't actually have a good intuition for like what geometry is preserved between brains, what geometry is not preserved, and so on, right? And so this process is largely manual right now. So we have a collaboration with people in the psychology department at Stanford looking at applying these tools to registration both of the outside of your brain and then in the inside of your brain. So from my sort of very theoretical perspective, your brain's sort of composed of two pieces, right? There's the gray stuff on the outside and the white stuff on the inside. And in the white stuff on the inside, there's this tool called the diffusion MRI. And his sort of goal in life is to get a very weak sense of where things move in the inside of your brain, right? There are all these little fibers that kind of foliate the interior of your brain. And the problem in this world of diffusion tractography is all about how you can trace out the fibers and actually understand how they induce connectivity on the outside, right? Now, effectively, in their world, what you get is at every point in the interior of your brain, you get a probability distribution over the unit sphere, which is where you think these fibers might be going based on sort of the weak vibration of water molecules, right? And so one thing that we've been talking to them a lot about is sort of how can you use this machinery for pre-processing, understanding, cleaning up this data, and then eventually how can you use it for sort of defining diffusive models and so on for understanding the connectivity that it induces outside. There's a lot of things to do there. It's a really exciting area. Yes?
So in the last example that you said about learning, it said semi-supervised.
Yes, sir.
So what is the semi-supervised?
Yes. So hopefully I've gotten the language correct here. In graph-based semi-supervised learning, what you have is a graph. For example, let's say that I have my social network and I know this is kind of an evil application, but maybe I have a social network and I know the incomes of a few people and I have assumption, which is probably a bad assumption, that I'm friends with people that have a similar income to me. Then you can use graph-based semi-supervised learning to kind of propagate, the few samples that I have on this graph to nearby people. So in this paper, we have actually, we have a theorem that shows that this method is sort of a probabilistic relaxation of a very classical sort of graph Laplacian technique for semi-supervised learning.
Like we're talking about different notions of distance and how some might or might not make sense for different domains.
Yes.
And how maybe we think when we see that they're free circles and that they should, maybe there are applications where they should be equidistant, and maybe clearly if we're talking about geometrically they shouldn't.
Right.
And in terms of like a translational aspect of this work, like application, to what extent like should there be some kind of maybe like pipelines or like a learning process like understand in certain contexts, certain applications, like what is the relevant distance metric? Or
in fact, there's an entire area of machine learning that's called distance metric learning, and is quite relevant to what we're doing. And in fact, one of the nice things that this language gives you, so something that I've assumed in today's talk is that this matrix of pairwise distances is somehow known. One thing you could do would be to revisit the original problem and kind of flip what's known and what's not known, and see if you could learn the actual pairwise distance metric. And this is an interesting problem for sure. There's some work out of Kyoto University that does exactly that. You're right that there are a lot of problems for which you don't know the distance metric, and in fact you don't know if there is a distance metric, right? Some problems just aren't geometric in nature, and you really shouldn't be using this for it. But I would argue that there are plenty that are, and for that this makes a lot of sense. In fact, this entire area of optimal transportation completely parallels something that's quite well known in this sort of area of information theory. Right, so there's this area called information geometry, which is all about sort of shared information between probability distributions. And there's sort of a very parallel theory that happens here. And so there's something to be said for you have to understand what type of data you have, what noise model you have, and what makes sense before you should use any one of these tools. And this is just sort of another in a very large toolbox of potential options.
So let us say you have multiple probability distributions. So you want to find pairwise Wasserstein distances between them. Can you do faster than n squared times the basic number?
Faster than n squared.
Times whatever it takes to find.
Well, of course, computing one of these is already. My intuition is actually yes. So there's a large literature. Well, not large. In the last 2 years, so not that big. Somebody has proposed this idea of multi-marginal optimal transportation. The idea that rather than just matching two distributions, you can do something more general. There's a gentleman in Canada. It's largely theoretical. There's actually an interesting question computationally there as to sort of what the right thing is to do. Exactly. Yeah, I completely understand. And I think the multi-marginal version of this problem is actually closely linked to these barycenter problems I talked about. Some of the ways that they pose that have fewer than n squared unknowns, because basically you can show, based on the sparsity pattern of this transportation matrix, that there's somehow some shared structure there. But I can't claim to be an expert on the algorithmic side. In fact, I think there's probably a lot of problems here that we simply don't know the answer to, and could be interesting fodder for more research. Yeah, I need some help from an algorithms guy for some of sort of the fundamental limitations and sort of how well we should expect to do on these problems. Still something that is largely unknown, right? In fact, I just went to a conference at Banff that was all about computational optimal transportation, and it's kind of a wild west right now of different things people are playing with. Thank you.